وكتابة نايلان مكنون شكل شنف المتر كتابة محمد فوتفل برشم كباب مخ برشم كباب مخ برشم كباب مخ Bergsham Club, Masuto Bed. All right, so let's. It is 6WR 5786, Thursday, April 23rd. No one really knows for sure. Alve Elo Differ Elo Kim Chaim, but this is the Mazar we live by. $37.61, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava. 36:31, 130, Seth, son of Adam, was born. 50, 35, 26, 235, Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 34, 36, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. Been doing this bitch 118 days, son. Brookatada Nile, Maklam Shirkat Shana Tivanu. Al Sefirat HaOmer, blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 22 days, which is 3 weeks and 1 day of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash in its place speedily in our days. Amen. Salah.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and Hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are obscure. Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism and hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. All right. We're really going to get into some of the more technical stuff around Shabbatai Tzvi, and we're going to talk about how what was at some level a movement became a dominant movement in the 16th, 17th century, and eventually how you think that the death of Shabbatai and the death of his prophet Nathan of Gaza would have spelled for the entire movement. But as you probably know, dying is not really an Messiah. Messiahs die all the time. Their believers keep on being in them as if nothing happened, whether it's Jesus of Nazareth or Menachem Mendel Schneerson of blessed memory. People continue to believe in their Messiah's death is just a speed bump on the way to eternity. And so we'll turn to that and how the Shabbatian movement continued after Shabbatai's death, and how it survived all the way probably at least into the 1880s, and maybe even later than that, especially in Turkey. We don't know what its status is. So what is the recap? Well, the recap is there was a guy in the 17th century that believed he was a Messiah, and so did the world's Jews. This is the recap. Shabbatai Tzvi, who was a Messiah by a relatively minor Kabbalist and healer in Gaza, 1665, although his intentions. And between 65 and 1666, half of the world's Jews seems to have accepted his messianic claims. And this is evidenced by the most classic example of the evidence for this is the prayer books that get printed. The prayer books that have pictures of Shabbatai Tzvi in them. The prayer books that have prayers for Shabbatai Tzvi. The letters that come over and over again from major rabbinical figures all over the Jewish world that affirm belief in Shabbatai Tzvi as Messiah. And we talked a bit last time about the life of Shabbatai Tzvi, the sort of the ups and downs of his life, of Nathan Gaza and Shabbatai Tzvi. But what we didn't get into last time is exactly
Legend.
The Messiah. How does that work exactly? Right? What do you think that it means to say the Shabbat? And this tell our things here on Kabbalah is that one can only understand the messianic claims of Shabbatai Tzvi, or of Nathan of God, and that was justified basically. It was justified, it was underwritten by the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah in a messianic story that allowed Shabbatai Tzvi claimed that he was the Messiah for Nathan of Gaza to greatly popularize his messianism. Now, there's a couple things to know that are important about Shabbatai Tzvi and Nathan of Gaza, his prophet, and how they're really important to know, is that they don't really have the same occasion. Shabbatai Tzvi is he's kind of a yeshiva dropout. He's very talented, he's very smart, and of course he's very charismatic, more charismatic than anything else, I suspect. But Shabbatai Tzvi doesn't have a very strong grasp on Kabbalah. He's very well. We know that. He's been studying the Zohar since a very strong grasp on the Zohar. But the developments in the Kvaran system of Kabbalah, the developments in the world of Sfat, the world of Lurianic Kabbalah, there's actually very evidence that Shabbatai Tzvi had a growth development. He doesn't seem to understand or appreciate or have education in the very complex world of. So we have just an education level when it comes to Kabbalah and Shabbatai Tzvi and Nathan of Gaza. Now, Nathan of Gaza, which is really about Nathan of Gaza, is he is hyper development in Lurianic Kabbalah. And I mean hyper aware. He is so well educated that if you read some of his Kabbalistic works, which are among the most technical Kabbalistic texts written at the time, he knows very subtle differences between different schools of Kabbalah. So he even knows differences between how very technical ideas in Lurianic Kabbalah are being debated among very high-level people in that world. For instance, people like Israel Sarug and Chaim Vital. So Nathan of Gaza is someone who knows these conversations. He is a technical maestro when it comes to the developments. He's at the cutting edge at some level of some of these developments. And it's going to be really important because how Nathan of Gaza is going to justify Shabbatai Tzvi's messianic claims are going to be by appealing to and, what's the right word? Augmenting, changing, corrupting, whatever word you want to use. he's going to be relying heavily on Lurianic Kabbalah, but he's going to do his own thing too. He's going to do his own thing. We'll see this in just a moment. Shabbatai, for him, his messianic claims, which we can see in his letters, are not justified by appealing to complex ideas in Lurianic Kabbalah because he doesn't know much about it. He's claiming that he is the Messiah because God chose him and because he has a relationship with God. That is to say, Hashem and Shabbatai are friends. So when Shabbatai calls God by God's name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Shabbatai doesn't imagine he's doing something transgressive. He knows he's not supposed to do it. But he has this intense personal relationship with God that he can call God by God's name. So for him, for Shabbatai, it has nothing to do with some very complex Kabbalistic mythological stuff. It has to do with the fact that God and Shabbatai are close. That can and God have a relationship. And that relationship is one of anointing. It's one of I have been invited in the world of the Godhead, and I have a relationship with Hashem. Now, that Christianity influenced at some level by Christianity, and part of what I think makes the Jewish world very uncomfortable with Shabbatai is not his transgressive behavior. His transgressive behavior gets really over, we'll talk about later. His transgressive behavior is his syncretism. He's okay with the idea of incorporating Christian elements, with incorporating skill elements, with incorporating Islamic elements. That's what worries the Jewish establishment. It's his syncretism that makes them really angry. Of course, he does these transgressive things, and that pisses him off too. But really, it's the syncretism that really gets him. And I think that's something that's coming forward new in the scholarship. And we were just talking about this before the recording started, is that part of what's going on now in the scholarship, we're now beginning to realize that Shabbatai Tzvi was much more at the helm of understanding what was going on than the previous generation of scholarship, mostly Gershom Scholem, thought. Scholem basically thought that at some level, Shabbatai Tzvi was a yeshiva dropout who had no real understanding of Judaism, much less really Kabbalah, and that he was a mentally ill person that rode on the coattails of the great prophet Nathan of Gaza. That was the theory that really, if you read Scholem's work, that's the theory that goes. More recent scholarship by Leaves and other kind of folks, Pavel Majenko, we really now know that's not true. Reasons for why he thinks he's the Messiah, as opposed to why Nathan of Gaza thinks it. So we're getting a much more complicated vision of who Shabbatai was, his theology, his ideas. The scholarship is continuing. So let's get into Nathan of Gaza. Let's get into Nathan of Gaza's theory, because that's going to really tie us back to the Kabbalah in a big way. So what does Nathan of Gaza think? Why does Nathan of Gaza think that Shabbatai is the Messiah? So it has everything to do with Kabbalah. It has everything to do with Lurianic Kabbalah. So just to rewind a little bit, right? We'll remember from the Lurianic theory that God was originally an infinite fullness, and that fullness filled the entire everything. And that in order to create creation, God had to contract God's self. And that act of contraction is called tzimtzum. Well, when God contracts what we call the Tehiru root, and the Tehiru, when it was evacuated, according to the Lurianic Kabbalah, it left behind traces of the divine. There are sort of fragment God left behind. I always imagine, you ever poured out oil from a cooking pan? There's always oil left, no matter how much you tip it over. You can't quite get all the oil out. The traces of the oil, the traces of the divine light, the Rishimu, coated or fragmented all over inside of the Tehiru, of the void. Well, some of those aspects of those traces within the divine void contained elements of divine judgment. Remember, divine judgment in the Kabbalah is always thought of when divine judgment is checked by other forces. That is evil. It's unbridled judgment. Well, those elements of deen, of unbridled judgment that remain inside of the void, those elements of unbridled vengeance and judgment, they sank the bottom of that void. As they sank the bottom of that void, those elements became the sort of the abyss, or the sort of demonic world, the bottom of that void of that when God zoomed. That area, by the way, is called the Golem, and Louis Kabbalah. It's called the Golem. It's the unformed world. It's just sort of chaos. It's a tohu bohu. It's this chaotic nightmare where all the evil has sunk to the bottom of the void. All right, so when God shoots God's light into that void, at the very tip of that spear, at the very tip of Yesod, at the tip of God's phallus, I suppose, at the tip of God's Yesod, the tip like plunged to the void, to the Tahir, and the tip of that, and this is where Nathan of Gaza comes in. This is not Lurianic Kabbalah, this is Nathan of Gaza. The tip of that void shoots all the way into the very bottom of the void, of the abyss, or the deep. And the tip of that is soul of the Messiah. The soul of the Messiah is the tip of the sphere, the tip of the light going all the way in. And as soon as it reaches the bottom, it comes back up. And all of God's remaining judgment in Ein Sof floods into the void, the demonic abyss, the golem. And the soul of the Messiah is the only thing good left at the bottom of that chaotic, nightmarish abyss of evil. And the soul of the Messiah is born, is deposited, according to Nathan of Gaza, at the very bottom of the abyss. And that abyss is filled with every form of evil imaginable. Every form of evil imaginable. The soul of the Messiah is born there, is put there. And there, the soul of the Messiah becomes infused with all this evil. And it's only through this unimaginable process where the soul of the Messiah has to redeem itself, has to climb out of this horrifying abyss of evil, that in the process of redeeming itself, eventually it pulls itself all the way up, right through these whole world of what I call the Tanaim, the dragons, the text, the treatise on the dragons. The Messiah's soul fights vigorously, strives to purify itself, re-purify itself of all this evil. Eventually, this is sort of the event horizon, right? If you want to think about this in terms of black hole, it's like a hole, but eventually the soul of the Messiah can get to the very top of the event horizon, right? And just pop through. When it barely pops through this horrific world of demonic power, it's still corrupt. It's still confused. And so it's still some battle of good and evil. It's still deeply polar, really, really, really good soul of the Messiah. And really bad, right? World of the Klipot, the Shah. And as it climbs out, it eventually crosses back through the event horizon of evil, which the black hole through. It's influence all. Defines the body defined, found the body, according to the Nation of Gaza, of poor Shabbatai Tzvi. And folks, that explains Shabbatai Tzvi. That explains these, according to these illuminations and these darkness periods, his sort of manic behavior, manic depression. Explains why he can and yet do these transgressive things, where he says that the 17th of Tammuz is a feast day rather than a fast. And it's that psychology and manically proof of his messiness. Because inside of Shabbatai is the struggle of the messianic soul against the world of evil. And for Nathan of Gaza, this entire process is the final act of history. Once Shabbatai is purified of all this evil, then everything will be redeemed. He is embodying, according to Nathan of Gaza, he embodies this final titanic struggle of good and evil. Now, what did the apostasy mean, right? Because again, Nathan of Gaza is formulating this idea in 1665. Nathan of Shabbatai apostatizes in 1666. Well, we have two completely different theories about what's going on here. We have Nathan's theory. Nathan's theory is that Shabbatai is plunging himself into the world of evil, that is to say, Gentile religion. Think about the Gentiles. He's plunging himself into in order to basically undermine it. That is to say, he's destroying it from the inside. Nathan of Gaza's theology is always the idea that Shabbatai is plunging himself into this to destroy it. He's like a double agent. He's sneaking the world of he's not really apostatizing. He's pretending to apostatize to put himself into this world to undermine it, to destroy the Klipot. What we know is, right, we have another view, which again is actually Shabbatai's view. Shabbatai also was the Messiah. Shabbatai's view was that he was actually he was plunging himself into this in order to redeem Islam. He thought of himself as a redeemer. He wasn't going into Islam to destroy it. He thought there was positive things in Islam. He thought there was positive things in Christianity. And the idea was that ultimately, by plunging himself into this, by plunging himself into Islam, he could redeem the world of the Muslims, and that will be part of the grand redemption. Notice these are very different theories. Notice that what Nathan thought was happening is one thing, and what Shabbatai is happening is something completely different. So notice here, even the Shabbatian movement isn't coherent in terms of what they thought was happening in terms of Shabbatai's messianic mission. And that's not surprising, because if you look at early Christianity, it's not clear that early Christianity really understood what Jesus' messianic mission was. And there was a huge debate about that. Paul thought one thing, James thought another, Peter thought something else. It's not clear that anyone really had a clue that Jesus' messianic mission was X, Y, or Z. You have these big debates in the church, ditto with the Shabbatian movement. Now, what do you about this, right, is that we have three important interlocking things that make this important. The first is all of them agree that whatever Messiah means, it's Messiah, which we talked about last time, which is the idea of a political Messiah. This is a spiritualization, the same thing that the movement did with Jesus. The Shabbatian movement does with Shabbatai, did it with Further, we have this quasi-Lurianic justification for Shabbatai's claims. Now, what's important to note about these sort of quasi-messianic justifications that they're going to be the ones that largely. Now, it's a case that some Shabbatians did have some letters of Shabbatai, but largely, what's going to stick is going to be the Lurianic quasi-read. I say quasi-Lurianic because a lot of this is not Luria. This is Nathan of Gaza sort of riffing on Luria. But yeah, riffing. And third, this is all part of a larger apocalyptic agenda, as we mentioned last time. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. The 17th century, the mid-17th century, was an age of hyper-apocalypticism. I mean, folks who remember the 1990s, remember the 1990s and how apocalyptic that was. You have the Branch Davidians, you have Y2K, you have all this. It was a very apocalyptic time. We'll take that and turn it up to 50, and that gives you what the 17th century was. So this is part of a much bigger apocalyptic world, and Shabbatai's messianic claims are all about the end of the world. And to give it a sense of that, I want to read a letter of Nathan of Gaza here, just a chunk of a letter from Nathan of Gaza. And I'll read it relatively briefly, just so you know kind of what the mood felt like. So this is a letter of Nathan of Gaza to Raphael Joseph, who was a Chalevi of Cairo, was a big wig in Cairo. He was the guy that gave Shabbatai job of Nathan of Gaza. These in-face opposing forces, they are ineffective, however, in injuring no one but themselves. For the final end is now upon us. Again, the apocalyptic level, the final end is now upon us. This being so, you must not wonder why, but especially our generation has come to deserve it. In addition, there are these dreadful agonies, inconceivable and limitless, that Rabbi he has suffered on behalf of the Jewish nation. Consequently, he has full power of this nation with him in existence, Jesus, even he would be the most highest person alive to unspeakable time. You must treat the following principle as absolutely certain. The Jewish people cannot attain to life other than by believing these things without any sign or miracle. All this is God's purpose enacted in this generation, worthy to see the beginnings of the redemption. The beginnings of the redemption. You must have no concern whatever for those who do not believe, even if they be your close personal friends. And then after that, what ends up happening is that Shabbatai describes the outline of what Nathan of Gaza thinks is going to be roughly a 100-year period in which all this is going to go down, and you get a sort of timeline about how this is going to go down, how Shabbatai is going to go, and all kinds of stuff. It's very, very bizarre. But at any rate, that gives you some sense of the fervor that Nathan of Gaza puts onto all this. Now, as we mentioned, Shabbatai died, and so did Nathan of Gaza. In fact, after Shabbatai died, Nathan of Gaza kind of redoubles his efforts, and he argues basically that Shabbatai's death is a kind of illusion, that Shabbatai is hidden. Christianity at some level here. Sounds like very that he's there is some actually not dead, and over and over again these predictions that Shabbatai will appear this year and this year and this year, and eventually Nathan of Gaza. Well, Nathan of Gaza dies, and as soon as Nathan of Gaza dies, the movement immediately begins to fracture. Because, of course, when you have Nathan of Gaza, who's probably one of the more talented Kabbalists to basically continue to steer Kabbalah, the movement begins to fall apart. And the first person to really pick up the reins of this movement will be himself. He would travel all around the Eastern Mediterranean basin, but also through Europe. He would be proclaiming the gospel, so to speak, of Shabbatai's feet, and he was murdered in 1706. So he was a huge creator of Shabbat. Once Shabbat, the women in the movement really take up the reins. And again, is it surprising? No. Think about Jesus. The moment that Jesus died, who were the only people? Right, we have the Marys, right? We have the women there. The men all scatter. Women, in a big way, hold the reins. And propelled the movement after Shabbatai had died. Now you'll remember that Shabbatai remarried after his first wife died, and his second wife, Aisha, or Yocheved, she went by both names. Actually, Aisha, or Yocheved, declared that her younger brother, Yaakov Corrido, was in fact the reincarnation of Shabbatai's feet. So what we have, again, is the use of Lurianic Kabbalah, the idea of soul roots, and Gilgul HaNeshemot, the idea of reincarnation, being marshaled to show that there's a continuity of Shabbatai's feast soul. He's not dead. He's just reincarnated. He's reincarnated, of course, into the younger brother here of Aisha Yocheved. And what ends up happening in this whole process is that there is some pressure being put on these quasi-Shabbatian Jews, Muslims, that are there living in places like Salonika and in places around the Shabbati movement. Remember that part of what happened with Shabbatai Tzvi is he was condemned for not being Muslim enough, and he was exiled all the way in what is now Montenegro. And so some of the people around him that stayed around him, about 300 families or so, these were Jewish believers in Shabbatai who had never converted to Islam, And eventually, with Aisha's pressure, probably she's getting pressure from the Ottoman Empire, they all convert. Right? We get a mass conversion of about 300 families who do convert to Islam in 1683, some years after Shabbatites died. That core of about 300 families, right, which is the size of basically this grew up in, that core was going to form the post-Shabbatian movement. That what would end up happening is in that time period, in the generation after death, the new faith of the Shabbatian movement would take effect. And basically, the new faith looks something like this. There is a Torah that is composed of 18 laws. There are 18 laws that make up the Torah of the Shabbatian movement. They do not have relationships with Jews, and they have outward relationships with Muslims, but they don't marry with Muslims, and they don't bury their dead with Muslims. So they don't associate with the Jewish crowd, because obviously they've been actually they're not Jews anymore, they're Muslims now. But what's important is they still follow an underground form made up of 18 laws, and that they only marry within ranks, and they only bury within their own ranks. And what ends up happening is this group of converted Muslim Jew Shabbatian people, they usually observe Islam completely. They dissimulate. They lie about the degree to which they're really Muslims. As precedent in some lodges in the Sufi movement, this is an idea called taqiyya, not the Hebrew word taqiyya. This is the idea that you can have Sufi beliefs. If those Sufi beliefs get you physically endangered, they can endanger you. So what they're living is basically a dual life. They're living quietly as kind of Jews, but publicly they're living as Muslims. But they're still not quite Muslims, and they're still certainly not Jews. There's something else. And this something else is going to eventually evolve into its own religion. Now, inside of the movement, as you might imagine, there are further fractures. The two major fractures, and there's going to be three major fractures within the Shabbatian movement that will occur. The first major fracture is that there's going to be another incarnation, a so-called incarnation of Shabbat Tzvi and Berechia Russo, who's now Turkish as Osman Baba. He'll die in 1720, which, by the way, is telling you how close we're getting to modernity, by the way. And he's declared to be one of the really important, he's been declared to be the legitimate inheritor of the Shabbatian nation of Shabbatai Tzvi. This is going to break the movement into two different groups. The smaller movement, which is the Yaqubi movement. The Yaqubi movement is actually very close to Sunni Orthodox Islam in the Qarakashi movement. And the Qarakashi movement is going to be much more syncretistic. We're going to maintain some relationships with Judaism, but it's going to more. Important to know about the Qarakashi movement is that they're going to have missionaries. And those missionaries are going to be sent to Eastern Europe. Again, it's developing in places like Montenegro. They're move their way into Central Europe, and eventually they're going to reach Europe in the Podolia region, Poland. And as you probably know, the Podolia region in Poland is going to be absolutely core in all of this. We'll get to that in a minute. There's going to be a third and final split. This is the Pansi movement. This is a group that rejects the reincarnation theory, that only is Shabbatai Tzvi, and they say that only Shabbatai, that there have been no reincarnations of Shabbatai Tzvi, only Shabbatai the Messiah. And this version is the idea that Shabbatai Tzvi is the only form of the Messiah. That group, which is actually pretty close to the very popular Mevlevi order, which I imagine folks know the Mevlevis, right? Those are the whirling dervishes. These are the famous whirling. So they're very close to them in a lot of ways. It's that part of the Shabbatian movement that's going to go on to become the one that will survive in Turkey. That one will survive in Turkey. We'll talk about that in a minute. So by the early to the mid-18th century, these groups would become the core of what we call the Shabbatian movement in the Ottoman Empire. And collectively, they're referred to as Dönme, right? Dunme. Now, this word actually means apostate, and many of them would not call themselves Dunme, but I would call them something like conversos or just Shabbatians, but the name Dunme is stuck. Now, you might be asking how many of these Donme were there in the Ottoman Empire. Well, they had a bit of a problem in terms of growing themselves because they only married within their own families, which led to all kinds of problems. So they were probably, we guess, sometime or somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men in the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century. So at the turn of there were 10,000 of these Shabbatians living in the Ottoman Empire. They were practicing Jews of a very strange type. They lived on the outside as Muslims, but on the inside they lived secretly as a kind of Jew. And they were kind of accepted. Everyone knew, I think, that they weren't completely Muslims, and everyone kind of knew that they weren't really Jews. They kind of did their own thing. They buried their own dead in their own graveyards. They only married each other. They lived in the same part of Salonika and eventually Istanbul. They were their own thing. And everyone at some level knew this. Now, what's important about the Donme is that there are two things that really important that are known about them, is that they became very, very well educated and very, very wealthy. This is often true for very tight communities, right? That is to say, they became skilled tradesmen, and they kept their money indoors, and they become actually educated and actually quite wealthy. And they were some of the earliest toward the West process of process in which Turkey modernized and a significant element of the Young Turk movement, which means they played a pivotal role in the development of Turkey as a modern nation. In fact, the first ministry for the new Turkey would be a Karachi deal. That's a leading member of the Turkish government was Donme. So now the problem with this is war on Turkey, and of course Israel came into warheads about all kinds of things. And what ended up happening was that there was a huge anti-Semitic backlash in Turkey, and that anti-Semitic backlash caught the Donme. The Donme were thought of as secret Jews, and the idea they were secret Jews was even more terrible. And so they basically completely abandoned any Judaism, and many of them completely secular. The question now these days is, are there any Donme in Turkey at all? And we don't know. We don't know. I think I mentioned this last time in my last lecture on the Shabbatians. I had a student in a class I taught her Shabbat speak. She came from Donme family, and she said that in Turkey that she would ask when they were Karachi people or from a family of Kompasi people, but a secular person, father was secular. My grandfather may have visited, whatever, a tomb, but no, there are no practicing Donme left. The problem with this, of course, is we don't know, because part of what the Donme do is they don't tell anyone they practice this. They practice this idea of takia, which means they don't make it public. They are, in fact, Shabbatians. So are there Shabbatians left in Turkey? Maybe. Probably not. They're probably extinct. But are there Donme families left in Turkey? Probably. Yeah, there are definitely Donme families left in Turkey. But are there any practicing Shabbatians in Turkey? The data seems to indicate no. It seems to be an extinct religion. But I'm leaving the door open for the possibility that they're still over there, but I think that the odds of them actually surviving are pretty low. So that gives us some idea that the Donme, at some level, Shabbatianism continued to survive and thrive all the way into at least the mid-20th century in Turkey, where it was kind of born. Now, as I mentioned, right, the Karkashi sect, the sect that holds that Osman Baba is the reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi, again, to get some idea of where we are, we're on 1720. That sect, the Karkashi, were much more willing to mix Judaism and Islam. And remember, it was that sect that sent the first post-Shabbatai missionaries into Eastern Europe. Now, you might wonder, why in the world would anyone listen to this in Eastern Europe? Why would Jews hear these guys out? Shabbatai's dead. He's been dead for a generation. It was a huge disappointment. It was a disaster. This entire thing was a disaster. Why would any Jews listen, despite the fact this entire thing, this disaster has happened? Well, the first thing is that Shabbatai's death actually happened really slow. It took a long time to get to Central Europe. And so unlike in the Ottoman era, where news traveled very fast, by the time the news got to Central Europe, Poland, things were very slow and frankly terribly educated. Jews in Central Europe in the early 18th century, Jews in Central Europe in the late 17th century, in the early 16th century, inclined group of people. Remember, some of the Ashkenaz, the Ashkenaz have historically been very interested in supernatural. The knowledge of Kabbalah at that time was very, very piecemeal in that area. Kabbalah in other areas was much higher, but at this point, early on in late in the 17th century, knowledge of Kabbalah was very, very, very piecemeal, very fractured. Those people coming in, some of these Karkashi missionaries carrying the gospel of Shabbatai Tzvi, had a much higher degree of Kabbalistic education at some level than the local people did. So this is very... Further, Orthodox Judaism in this region was much, much more oriented at the level of practice than belief. What really mattered for these people, and this is true for many factions of Judaism, is it matters much more what you do at some level than what you believe. And so belief was a bit more weird. You could have a much more broader range of belief and still practice Judaism. You could believe all kinds of things about werewolves, vampires, and stuff, and it was okay as long as you practiced Judaism in a nominal way. And further, these communities were very precarious. You're talking about a place where during Shabbat, right before Shabbatai's life, it experienced a giant pogrom that killed 100,000 Jews probably. And this entire area was subject to constant problems with the local population, where there are constant pogroms. And so there's also just a level of instability and fear and messianic claims in environments like that, where there's precarious existence, they become much more tenable. It's much more easy. Poor, uneducated people who live a precarious existence of the existence of a Messiah that will save them. True, we can see that playing itself out lots of times in history. When the Shabbatian movement landed in Central Europe, in general, it kind of took. It's always going to kind of take in Central Europe. Talk more about. Now, what's important to know about the after of Shabbatai Tzvi's apostasy in 1666 is that most people deconverted. They rejected his messiahship. What's rejected? People were the rabbis of the local region, like Manasseh ben Israel, for instance, in Amsterdam. And Manasseh ben Israel, who was anti-Shabbatian the entire time, once the fervor of the Messianic movement ended, Manasseh ben Israel was basically able to rein his flock in, shepherd them in the aftermath of the disaster. In many ways, Amsterdam was typical because Amsterdam was hotly Messianic, very Messianic, maybe one of the largest Messianic centers in the world. And then after the 1666 apostasy, people were really disappointed, and Manasseh ben Israel, the rabbi of the community there, was able to basically shepherd them through the disaster. What ends up happening, however, in Central Europe is that some of the influenced by these missionaries, some of these learned rabbis continue to hold their faith in Shabbatai in private, while in public denying it and remaining Orthodox. So we have people that are secretly maintaining some Shabbatian ideas, yet at the same time, publicly, they are not holding on to them in public. We call these people crypto-Shabbatians. And what ends up happening is that as Kabbalistic ideas begin to make their way into Central Europe in the after Shabbatai, you can imagine the wave that, and then Shabbatai brings the Messiah claims of Shabbatai bring this wave into Central Europe. What gets left behind after he leaves, the clans wash out. What gets left behind is the Kabbalah. He brings in the Kabbalah, and then he comes out because he apostated or whatever, and what's left behind is the Kabbalah. And so as he leaves behind, as the movement leaves behind these Kabbalistic traces, the rabbis who are left behind with the belief in Shabbatai Tzvi as the Messiah continue to believe in Shabbatianism as movement, all the while still holding on to many of these Kabbalistic ideas, and it's the Kabbalistic ideas that still continue to convince them that he is in fact the Messiah, that maybe he is occulted, maybe he is actually just diving himself into the deep recesses of the Klippa. He will eventually redeem them somehow, right? This is all part of the plan. And what ends up happening, that very early Kabbalah in Central Europe is always at some level tinged with a Shabbatian element. All Kabbalah in Central Europe in the early century, late 17th century, is going to be tinged with Shabbatian elements. And there are a lot of crypto-Shabbatian works, right? Chemdat Damim, Shavdat Musar. We have other kinds of movements, other kinds of texts that are incredibly influential. We'll talk about that influence in just a minute. And this ultimately erupts in the Emden Ibishutz controversy. And the Emden Ibishutz controversy is a situation where two one is declared to be a Shabbatian. He's declared to be a crypto-Shabbatian. And he denies it. He says, no, I'm not, no, I'm not, no, I'm not. This debate, by the way, was not settled in their lifetime. Both Emden and Ibishutz eventually died. And for a long time, people believed that Emden's critique of Ibishutz was that he was not really a Shabbatian. Now we know, probably was. We actually have to believe was in fact a Shabbatian, crypto. In fact, to this day, it's not even clear who was and who wasn't. We still don't know who was a Shabbatian and who wasn't at this time period. This would be a minor issue of the most important Jewish movement in basically the modern period, and that movement, of course, is Hasidism. And so in many ways, the disdain between the Shabbatians and the anti-Shabbatians, the crypto-Shabbatians and their condemners, is also going to track to the rise of Hasidism and the Mitnagdim, the people that condemn them, the opponents of the Mitnagdim that in the century that comes later. Now, I'm going to make some really controversial statements that will make people who are very amenable to Hasidism maybe a little upset, but the data is now showing, the evidence is now showing that early Hasidism and Shabbatianism, there is a relationship there. It's obscure and it's difficult, but there are so many overlapping elements of both early Hasidism and European Shabbatianism that it's, I think, undeniable that at some level, the movement, the Hasidic movement, at some level, is at least influenced by Shabbatianism. I don't want to say an outgrowth of Shabbatianism. I don't think that's true. But the idea that they're completely distinct, I think, is no longer holdable by the Hasidic movement. They would deny it, but I think it's there. So why do I think that? Well, it's, for instance, things like the role of the Tzaddik or the Rebbe, the idea that they're a sort of intermediary, a kind of quasi-Messiah, as they act as sort of a intermediary between them and God. The Rebbe is often sometimes thought of as engaging in transgression for the sake of heaven. This idea that they suffer on behalf of the community, for the community. The emergence of both of these movements, the Shabbatian movement and the Hasidic movement, both emerge in the exact same region of Poland, the Podolia region. It's from there. We'll talk about Hasidism next time, but I'm just saying I do think that the Hasidic movement and the Shabbatian movement that there's some overlap. Both of them are very influenced by Kabbalah, Lorraine Kabbalah. There's an antinomian streak in Hasidism. Obviously, you can find that in Shabbatianism as well. There's this stuff of Avodah Bagashmiut, the sort of physical stuff that the Hasidic people do. That also seems to be also typically law-wise very conservative, but there's still an antinomian streak, and there's even legal innovations in Hasidism that are not to be found in the Misnag movement. For instance, the wearing of that is deeply influenced by Kabbalah. It's not to be found in more Litvak style Judaism. That's an element that comes especially in Hasidism. As you probably know, the world of Hasidism is very court-like. It's very royal. The Rebbe is treated almost as a kind of regal figure, as a kind of king, and there is a quasi-messianic attitude toward the Rebbes in the Hasidic movement. We know that Shabbatian text played a huge role in early Hasidism, especially Yamim, and in many ways, the Misnah movement, the Litvak movement, the movement that was very critical of Hasidism, saw in many ways Hasidism extension of the Shabbatian movement. And early on, when it was after the early Hasids, he really claims that they, under the hood of it all, is Shabbatianism, that they actually are Shabbatians. Now, I think that in general, does the Vilna Gaon overplay his cards? Maybe he does overplay his cards. But is he completely off base? I don't think so. I think the Vilna Gaon's not crazy, and he's not a fool. I think he's not just being polemical or saying political. I don't think he's just writing these people off. I think there's actually a relatively strong argument to be made that there is a strong influence of the Shabbatian movement, the crypto-Shabbatian movement in Central Europe, especially the region, on early Hasidism. But we'll get to Hasidism next week. Now, in Podolia, the region I just mentioned in Poland, this movement continues to change and it continues to mutate, and it will mutate into perhaps its most absolutely bizarre form under the leadership of Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank was born into a Shabbatian family. He left Podolia to move to the Ottoman Empire. He joined up with the Karakashi sect. In fact, Osman Baba was a witness at his wedding in 1752. 1752, folks. We're in 1752, FYI. This is 25 years or so until, the American Revolution. So he moved back to Podolia, and he begins to a pretty serious quasi-transgressive form of Judaism, and we have what is called the Landau Affair, where it seems like in a synagogue he may have had a naked woman who was the embodiment of the Torah, kind of sex stuff in the synagogue, dancing around this naked woman who was the embodiment of the Torah. And in 1751, him and his followers were executed by the local rabbis. Now, there is an idea that gets attached to Frankism and Shabbatianism, which is called mitzvah haba'ah avera. This is sometimes translated as redemption through sin, but this is a complete misreading of what's going on in Shabbatianism. In fact, almost everybody who totes this idea, I think, is misguided. This idea of redemption through sin, that you have to commit sins to become redeemed, this idea of mitzvah haba'ah avera, this idea never occurs in, to my knowledge, any Shabbatian writing. It gets hoisted onto the Shabbatians over and over and over again that what they're doing is engaging in antinomian behavior. They're engaging in violations of the Jewish law in order to hasten redemption, in order to redeem the klipot and redeem the klipot, in order to somehow redeem sin through, or redeem themselves through sin. There's just virtually no evidence in this for practicing Shabbatai Tzvi. Next, that argument, neither does Nathan of Gaza. But this term, mitzvah haba'ah, which is an idea actually founded, has to do with can you commit do mitzvah with a with a forbidden object. So can you wave a stolen lulav and esrog? And the rabbis say no. Right? You can't commit a mitzvah breaking another mitzvah. And so even the idea of this is just ridiculous, and anti-Semites and stuff who have these vast conspiracy theories that somehow all of modern Jews, all kinds of people, Joros or whatever, that these people are somehow Frankist lineage of the Rothschilds and all this stuff, and that they're real secret Frankists and they're engaged in horrifying sins, and the more sin they do, they can redeem themselves. And so this entire anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is rooted in the idea of the Frankists and the Shabbatians practicing this idea of mitzvah havera. But the truth of the matter is, they never, and that was not what they were up to. To say that anyone who wants to believe in this, just show me in the Shabbatian literature where this idea is spoken. I don't know that it ever is. I can't find that's a single thing. What Frank does argue is that that what's happening is that he is inaugurating a Torah. The new Torah that he is inaugurating is a replacement, right? So you have the right, and he's inventing a new Torah. He's conjuring into being new Torah, and that new Torah is wisdom, knowledge, the das is how you would say it, Ashkenazi Hebrew, but this is the Torah into the world, and that new form of the Torah is going to be this thing that he calls a new religion called. Now, we'll go through this really, really quickly. What ends up happening is that Frank and his followers are arrested. They flee to convert to Islam, like many Frankists or many time. And what they end up doing is sort of making a deal with the devil. And by the devil, I mean here Catholic bishops. And what they end up doing is they of Jews by the Zohar who reject the Talmud. And that the other camp, the anti-Shabbatians, the anti-Frankists, reject the Zohar. Now, of course, the Jews accepted both, and the Shabbatians with the local Jewish population basically condemned them. The Shabbatians argue with the advisors of 19 and the bishop is take the bishop, whoever, and the bishop obviously sides with the Shabbat and Talmud. Is happening again. Hit bishop in 1757. He dies, and a new bishop emerges who is no longer a friend. At this point, Frank declares that he's actually the reincarnation of Osman Baba and Shabbatai Tzvi, and he begins to that. Oh man, this gets so complicated. There's a local bishop who wants to basically prove the blood libel's true and sacrifice and kill the host. This sort of classic anti-Semitic nonsense. He holds another dispute in Lvov, 59, a blood libel be converted, and Nathan and Frank, September 17th, 1759, they side with this bishop, land and stuff, and also the Jews, including Frank, also standing. And in Catholicism, 3,000 Jews are converted to Catholicism on the 16th of September 1759. It's a disaster. I don't think Frank himself even thought this was going to happen. Now, Frank, being, I think, completely full of himself and I think just delusional with power, holds that this is part of the plan. Just like Shabbatai had to convert to Islam, well, Frank, being the reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi and Osman Baba, he's going to plunge himself into the world of Catholicism. And after he converts, he lives a life of a Polish noble. He lives a life of a Polish noble. He's wearing fine clothes, doing all this stuff. But at the same time, he is also engaged in very, very heterodox behavior. And in a way that the Turkish court would accept Shabbatai engaging in very strange behavior, the local Catholics aren't having it. They are not having it. Eventually, they arrest Frank, and he is basically sent to prison in a monastery for 14 years. So he's arrested and sent to a monastery for 14 years because they do not want to deal with him. The Catholics are not playing around, perhaps in the way that the Turks were. In 1772, Russian forces invade Poland, and they release him. They actually release him from this monastery where he's being kept. And he kind of cozies up to members of the Holy Roman Empire. He gets comfortable with Joseph II. He meets Paul I, the future Tsar of Russia. And it's in that time period that he writes his principal Frankist Shabbatian work, a text called The Collection of the Words of the Lord, which is published in English now. What ends up happening is that he gets into kerfuffle with Joseph II, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He's expelled from the court, and he ends up settling, and eventually he dies of a stroke in 1791. 1791, right? We're like in the middle of the French Revolution at this point, right? 1789, we're just not far out of terror. The point, at about 1791, his daughter, Ava, takes control of the movement. Again, it's women who rescue this movement. There are about 25,000 Frankists. That is to say, Catholics living as crypto Jews in Poland in the late 18th century. And what ends up happening is Ava Frank leads the movement into the future, basically building a giant court around her. She actually claims that she's the daughter of all these Russian royalty or whatever. And there is a huge Shabbatian center at both Warsaw and Prague, both under her control. And she lives like a princess, folks. I mean, people, like, the amount of money that she spent to maintain her lifestyle basically bankrupted the movement. And when she died in September of 1816, the movement was so heavily indebted that it had to collapse under its own weight. I mean, she lived like a monarch in the area. By the 1880s, we know that the movement sort of limping on, although many people began to realize that just being Catholic is a better idea than trying to maintain this bizarre double life. And so many people through the 1860s and 70s began to convert and began just to be Catholic. We just continue to be Catholic. And by the 1880s, we have very little evidence that people are practicing crypto Judaism anymore. They're Shabbatians, but they're very emotionally Ava Frank. And Frank became sort of a cult of personality all of her own, and it became less about Shabbatai Tzvi and less about Nathan, less about Frank and more about her and her cult of personality. And what we end up having is people basically by the 1880s largely converted to regular old Catholicism, although some people decom Judaism. So there's a bit of a split there, and the evidence that split, you may know this family. It's a very Catholic family. They becomes a pretty Catholic, pretty famous Catholic person. I'm sure I'm going to pronounce their name wrong, but you probably recognize the Wojtyla family. You probably know who that is. The family of John Paul II. That's the family of John Paul II. There is good evidence, good reason to believe that the former Pope, John Paul II, is a descendant of one of the converted Frankist families, right? Now, that's the side that became Catholic. Obviously, John Paul II is pretty Catholic, and he comes probably from one of these Frankist families. On the other side, another group of families that deconvert, they go back to Judaism, and a kind of liberal Judaism, a kind of Turkish-style Judaism, like the Young Turks. A very liberal, progressive form of Judaism is the Brandeis. And of course, the Brandeis, as you may know, Louis Brandeis became the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And when his family inheritance, an image, a picture of Ava Frank. He came from a Frankist family, and he kept this heirloom. Now, does that mean that Louis Brandeis, Atian, blah, 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 blah? No. He probably was a liberal Jew, just like many liberal Jews that you'd recognize from lots of places anywhere in the United States at the time. But picture of Ava Frank, and he comes from a Frankist family. I think he was a practicing Shabbatian in any form or fashion. Absolutely not. Any more than I think the jump on this. All that I want to point out here as I wrap up for the night, Frankism a huge impact on the development of Judaism. So the Judaism in Central Europe, the rise of Hasidism is probably at some level a Frankist movement. They're part of, or at least a Shabbatian, an expression of a kind of Shabbat. Hasidic movement by this. We have prominent families who emerged in the aftermath of the disaster and the rise of the international movement. And then we have families who are very prominent Polish families, like the family of John Paul II and the family of Louis Brandeis, emerged from the Frankist movement, from the Shabbatian movement, and are part of world history in a big way. There are even neo-Shabbatians. There are neo-Shabbatians. In fact, my channel, the Ezra channel, I have a couple of folks who are neo-Shabbatians. I express the idea that Shabbatianism was a catastrophe. I'm not apologize for that. I think it was a catastrophe. But I think if someone finds Shabbatai Tzvi to be an interesting figure, but what I just want to hammer home tonight, as I wrap up this lecture tonight, is that we cannot imagine Judaism coming into modernity without Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai Tzvi is the bridge, in many ways, of Judaism from the world of the medieval Kabbalah, and at some level has to be seen as in the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi, as in the shadow of Shabbatian movement. All of the Messianic stuff and the Chabad Lubavitch movement, Reform Judaism, all of it. At some level, it is in the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi. And there's no way that we can deny it, I don't think. And so, in many ways, if you want to understand modern Judaism, you have to understand the level as a response to the Shabbatian movement. And in that way, in a big way, Shabbatai Tzvi is still around. Because in many ways, we are living in the shadow cast by this peculiar Messiah who apostatized to Islam, continued to be Jewish or something. To drag this point and to put a fine point on it tonight as we wrap up, modernity, Jewish modernity, is in many ways in the shadow. The more we learn of him, the more we understand him, the more we understand the movement that came after him, whether it is the fractures in his death or the Frankist movement, the better man Jewish origins, whether it be the Hakalah, the Hasidic movement, the Misnagdim, whatever. They're all in the shadow of this guy. And I think it's quintessentially important to understand him, Nathan of Gaza, the theology, the Kabbalah. It really is in many ways downstream of him. And so, Shabbatai Tzvi, a Messiah who, in many ways, in a lot of ways, I think of Judaism in some ways, of pre-modern Judaism being bookmarked between two Messiahs, and that's Jesus of Nazareth and Shabbatai Tzvi. You can bookmark Judaism, evil ancient Judaism, between those two bookmarks, and that modernity is in the aftermath and the shadow of Shabbatai. So, whether you're embarrassed of him or not, whether you think he's crazy or not, whatever, you certainly can't deny, I don't think you can deny, that we have not, as a Jewish relation, come into a real grasp of the pact that he made. And I think that we're worse off for that. I think the better we understand Shabbat and his messianic movement and vicissitudes, the better we will understand Judaism, the better we will understand Jewish modernity, and the better we will understand Zionism, and all of that. And if we don't do that, we do that at our peril. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic and Hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, religion.
Sorry, bro. Okay. $6.13.